So good morning, everybody. I'm Veronica Reynolds, Head of Community Relations at New City Library. And today I'm really pleased to welcome Mary Beth Keane. She's an award-winning author of 3 successful books, including her latest, Ask Again, Yes, which will soon be out in paperback. It spent 8 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and was named one of the best books of the year by People, Vogue, Parade, NPR, and Elle. And we're proud to call her a Rocklander as well. So welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So we have a list of questions to get through. We have some submitted by our staff and some submitted by patrons. So I thought we'd start with some general ones.
Okay.
So did you want to be a writer as a child, or was it something you started to do as you got older?
I have wanted to be a writer since before I knew it was a thing you could be. I think as soon as I was conscious of writing as a thing that had to be done, in order to get a story, that's what I wanted to do. I think I felt really jealous of writers who made me feel a certain way. When you're a kid, you feel worried or you feel relief, when you're reading a book. And I thought, I want to do that to someone and make them feel all those things. So yeah, goes way back.
Well, I think mission accomplished. And of course, our big question is, did you grow up in Rockland? How is it?
I grew up 30 feet from where I currently live.
That's great.
Which is, so I live in Pearl River. I went to college, thought I would never come back to Rockland like a lot of, 18-year-olds with attitude problems. And I went to Barnard College, and then I lived in the city for a couple years after that. And then I moved to Virginia to do an MFA at UVA in Charlottesville. And I still never thought I'd come back to Rockland. I got married. My husband got a job in Philadelphia. We moved to Philly. And then all of a sudden, I was expecting my second child, and his job got transferred. And then it just seemed to make the most sense. So it was funny, this house became available when we were looking. And I thought, my mother mentioned it, and I said, no, obviously I could never live that close to home. And then, I don't know, the more pregnant I got, the more appealing it felt, to be that close to my mom and dad. So that's where we are. It's very normal here in Pearl River, but other people tend to think it's a little nuts.
Well, if it makes you feel better, I live 10 miles from where I grew up as well.
Okay. Oh, but I live 30 feet. I'm like, yeah.
It's close.
Yeah.
So how do you think being a Rocklander has influenced your writing?
It's really hard to say. I get this question about influence a lot. And I think it's just something, it becomes part of your DNA. And you can't, it's sort of like asking how being 5'8", affects my writing. I don't know how much. I do think that there, at least in Pearl River, there is a sensibility that is different than a lot of other places. I think maybe it's being working class. There's like a practicality about the people here. I don't think that we Pearl River people stand for too much navel gazing. If that, too much feeling sorry for yourself, too much, that can go into, negative territory too, if you're not given room to air out your feelings. But for the most part, I think that's in me, sort of a practical, no nonsense view of the world. Hopefully there's warmth in that too. But I've recognized it more in the years that I've left, and I've been able to compare Pearl River to other places. But Rockland as a whole, it's hard to sum up. I think it has a lot of different pockets and personalities. But I am a Rocklander, I guess, through and through.
It's not a bad thing to be, right?
Oh, I agree.
So I want to know, how did it feel when you found out you were on the bestseller list the first time?
It felt crazy. I mean, I was already exhausted. I'll actually never forget it. I had done an event in Boston at a place called Newtonville Books, and I had to drive from Boston to New Hampshire to Portsmouth, for an event there at some venue I didn't really know that much about, and I'd rented a car rather than take the train, and I was rushing, and my publisher called, and I was in a crowded lobby in my hotel. And it's always a weird sign when they're all on the phone, like my editor, her boss, my publicist, a couple of other people in the room. I'm like, this is either terrible or there's good news, but then you don't want to guess and then be wrong, you know? So it was awesome. We just all screamed on the phone, but then hanging up was strange because I was all alone in a city that I didn't know, about to see a room full of strangers I didn't know. I remember going into the venue at Portsmouth and telling these young, they were probably assistants, like 22 or 23. I'm like, oh my God, I just found out a half hour ago, this book's on the bestseller list. They could not have been less impressed.
Oh
And
no.
that was, they were like, cool, you know, who was here last week? You know, and I was like, you know what, that's a really good thing to have happen. I'm like, okay. Anyway,
Perspective
trying to get to
immediately.
work. Yeah. Like nobody's letting anybody's head get too big. But it was really, really nice.
Good. That's really cool. So on top of that, you've also won several awards. So I was just curious, was there one that was like the most meaningful to you to achieve?
Um, you know, they all mean a lot and seem to come at times in my life that I really need them. The Guggenheim was clutch because of when it came. I won it in 2015, and I was working on this book, but really, really struggling hard. Um, and there's such a long distance between when you apply for these things and then either get the award or don't. Not that all awards you have to apply for, but that one you do. And I think I had so much optimism when I was applying, and I had a clear sense of what I was doing. And then, you know, 6 or 8 months go by and you just feel a little bit lost. And so I really think I was on the verge of giving up on this book altogether. And then that came out of the blue, and it felt sort of a sign that I should keep going. Also, you know, financially, it's such a boost. You know, this isn't a hobby. A lot of people seem to talk about writing and treat it like it is a hobby, but for me and for a lot of other people, it's not. And so, you know, it was much needed at that moment in time.
So writing is your primary job at this
Yeah,
point
now it
now?
is. In the past, I've taught and sort of balanced. I've probably taught more than I've written, and but now writing is the bulk of what I do. I do like teaching, and so I do pick up an occasional workshop at Barnard, in particular. I just enjoy the students. I think they keep me in touch with something young and, like, you know, what's in the zeitgeist right now. And so, but writing is my main source of income. Yeah.
That's great. Hard thing to achieve in this day and
I
age.
mean, it took like, you know, 22 years, but yeah.
Sure. Sure. It's competitive out there.
Hmm.
So a lot of these questions came from Brian Jennings. So I just wanted to preface how this came about. Brian, right before the quarantine, mentioned that he was reading Ask Again, Yes, and he was really enjoying it. And when he went into quarantine, I believe he finished Walking People and Fever.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and just as a side note,
Time.
Walking People is available on Overdrive. So if you're interested in reading something you haven't read yet, that is available on Overdrive through the library as well. So he sent me a few questions, and we have some from some other people as well. So we figured we'd go in chronological order of the books themselves. I hope that's okay.
Okay. Sure.
So we'll start with the Walking People. So how did you first hear about the Traveling People? What drew you to them?
So my parents are Irish born. My father's from Galway and my mother's from Mayo. And we went to Ireland a lot as kids. And there were these people who used to be, you'd see them sometimes, you know, on the sides of roads or in camps, and or even in town. You just felt that they were different. And I used to ask, you know, who are they? And my parents would never really give me a straight answer as to who they were. And so I guess I just got curious, and at some point I just started writing a book that included them. The book didn't really begin with them. Um, and I had to learn a lot about that culture. It began with the Cahill family and what happened to them and immigration. But I started to realize there was a quality to one of the characters, and I decided to make him a traveler. And so it was really interesting. I think research helps all sorts of fiction. And so throwing myself into that research made that whole culture come alive. But that's how I learned about it.
That's great. Did you know people personally who worked in the tunnels? Was that
Yeah,
something?
my dad was a sandhog for 30 something years. And it was funny. I asked him if I could go down into a tunnel to see what it was like. And, when you're writing, you need the world that you're creating to feel authentic. So being a sandhog was not, a sandhog is a New York City tunnel worker, by the way, for people who don't know. It's not a key part of his personality, but if you want to see someone at work and what they have to struggle through, day to day, I like using the jobs that I know about. And so that I've always thought it's such an interesting job. It's such an important job that's completely underappreciated. Um, but anyway, so there was a tunnel. At that point, there was an access point on 11th Avenue and like 32nd Street. And I asked if he was retired, but he could bring me down maybe with his connections. And he was it's so Irish. He did not want me to tell anybody that I was writing a book. And so this is at the last moment, we're like putting on hard hats, and I brought my wellies, and I was like, well, what am I doing then? And he's like, you're in college, you're writing a paper. At this point I was like 28 years old. So I was like, okay, fine. It was just too posh. It's too fancy. He was as proud as could be when it came out, but when you're writing it, it was like mortifying, I think, that I was writing a novel.
Do you think it's especially because it was your first book, so it wasn't like a proven?
Probably. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, at least he let you down. How was that experience? What was it like being down there?
It felt really special to be there. I know that a lot of people don't get to go down there, especially women. And so I just wanted to take a look and see what, it felt like to be lowered down the shaft. It's like sort of a cage. It's an elevator, but you're sort of in a bucket/cage. That's really scary. At some points, the tunnel is like 1,000 feet deep.
Wow.
And you get lowered really slowly. I can see how someone could be really scared of that. Also, to work in the dark, it really hit me that he would arrive to work in the dark, at maybe 5 o'clock in the morning, work down in the dark during all the daylight hours, and then emerge in the dark. And so for, 15, 20 years, it's just a very strange life. And I guess I appreciated more of what he went through, for us.
Sure. It's a unique experience for sure.
Yeah.
So in the middle of the book, there's a chapter that is letters back and forth. It gets epistolatory, I think is how you say it.
Yeah.
Why did you switch to that format? What got you interested in that?
I wrote that book so long ago. I love the first person point of view. I've started each of my books in the first person and hoped that I was writing my first person novel. I've ended up scrapping it each time. And I think the letters section allowed me to write in the first person, but not sustain an entire novel in the first person. I think you can hear a person's voice. There's an immediacy to letter writing. And I just love them. So I wanted to include them. Also, that time in history, the Cahill, Greta and Joanna came in the 60s to New York. My mother has boxes of letters, between her and her sisters, her mother, wrapped up in little, ribbons and in shoe boxes. And I thought, we're not going to have that now. We have all our emails, but there's something really romantic about that. Not that I'm a romantic writer, but there was something very alluring about that, I guess, that I wanted to capture.
And I think it's kind of timely because I know as far as my life goes with quarantine, we've certainly been writing letters. I've been working with my son to write letters to his family, because we're all home to receive them.
Right.
So I think we
nice
might have our own little stack.
Plus, we're saving the postal service.
Right. Buy stamps. All right. So let's move on to what may unfortunately be your most timely book right now, Fever.
Oh, God.
Unfortunately. This book had so much research behind it. You could feel how well researched it was. So I was curious about where did you find your source material? What was your research process?
Oh, God, all over the place. So I started writing that book after seeing the Nova documentary about Mary Mallon. And I had finished The Walking People. I was sort of casting around it hadn't come out yet, but I was casting around for a new idea. And I told myself I absolutely did not want to write a historical novel. Mm-hmm. But then just in my own life, nothing to do with writing, I was interested in her. And so I read a biography about her by Judith Walser Levitt, called, Jesus, why do I not remember? And it has Typhoid Mary. It's an academic book, highly readable, really great book. But I started to get a sense that her voice had been left out for the most part of her story. So a lot of us have heard of Typhoid Mary. Few people know that she was a real person. Even fewer people know that she never had symptoms of typhoid fever. And I guess it started to rankle me a little bit that her story was told almost entirely by her lawyers, doctors, journalists, all of whom were these really well-educated men at the turn of the century. And I thought she was smart. She wasn't educated, but she was also an outlier. She lived with a man without being married. She immigrated on her own. You know, it ended up being sort of a moral indictment as much as it was, you know, a sanitary indictment of her.
Right.
And I guess that all just started coming to a head, and I started writing from her point of view. Since this pandemic, I've thought a lot about some of the questions I've taken on when I went on tour for that book. People angry that she didn't listen to the people who were telling her. So she had no symptoms. She was in her 30s. She was making money. She was really doing well in a city that it's, you know, notoriously hard to do well in. And someone took her out of her life without arresting her, without a warrant. They just literally took her physically and put her on an island and told her she had to stay there. And they thought she was, because she wasn't educated, that she probably wouldn't understand. She did understand. Like, if anyone had taken the time to really explain to her, maybe she would have understood better. But she definitely was in some sort of denial. And people have really judged her for that. Now I wonder if those people would feel differently. If you don't feel well, if you feel like 100%, you want to go out and run 6 miles and brush up against people, or you want to go to the movie, you know, right now, there are people who'll be like, why can't I? You know, the sun is shining. Why can't I go into a backyard and, you know, gather on a deck with all my friends right now? And so I think we are so quick to imagine how we'd respond in certain situations. And I think we're almost always wrong. I really do. Until we're presented with a situation, we don't know what we would do. Yeah.
I always think that's what's interesting about fiction, is it almost lets us practice our response to things that we can't anticipate happening to us.
But people always cast themselves in the role of the good guy. Like, I would never have, you know, Ask Again, Yes, it comes up a lot too. And I'm like, the point is, I think, when I'm writing, is to find out the ways in which we surprise ourselves. You know, you don't see what's coming in a situation that you've never been in. And I think the ways we surprise ourselves are the things that make us most interesting. And that was certainly true for Mary Mallon. I don't know. I guess writers have, I don't know. I guess I get surprised by a lot of the judgment I've gotten about her when I had nothing but sympathy, really.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, why was she in denial? Well, why is anyone in denial about anything? So, yes, she's having quite a moment now.
Yeah, I think you would get a different reaction now, because I think all of us, unfortunately, now are potentially her, right? If you're asymptomatic, you just don't know.
Yeah, we're all Typhoid Marys. Yeah, she's getting a little stage time now. Even I think sales of the book have gone up a little bit, which is funny. Like, you know, 6 years later, or however long it's been.
Sure. Yeah, I know it's.
I'll take it. It's lovely.
I know for sure that you know, interest in general in like the Spanish flu, you know, but works about the Spanish flu have gone up as well. Anything timely like that.
I think people like to know that we've been through this before.
Right.
You know, and we will go through this again. It'll all be fine for the most part. You hope. I like putting things in a historical context. It makes me feel better. Some people don't. My husband gets even more panicked, I think. But, you know, whatever floats your boat gets you through.
I keep saying to my husband, I'm just imagining 15, 20 years from now, not even that long, my son's 5, him coming home like a high school assignment. Mom, what did you do during quarantine?
I know.
How was that? You know, the words, I'm going to become the past so quickly, is an interesting thing to grapple with.
I told my kids that they were bickering and I wanted to distract them. I said, you know, this is a time you'll tell your grandkids about. They'll say, weren't you around? What did you do? So you were stuck at home and and they'll tell a story. And then I coughed, I guess, just an allergy cough. And they'd be like, oh, that would be a good story. If you died, mommy, during this? I was like, you are a pair of sickos. I'm
That's
so
kids
there.
for you. Morbid.
Okay, let's not take it that far, but you will be telling your grandkids what you were doing during this.
Sure. I think absolutely. It's not even a question. So one of the things I always find interesting when authors speak about, and maybe you have one of these, is there a fact that you ran across when you were doing research that you really liked but could not find a place to put in the book?
In which book? Fever?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I did research for that now. It was starting in like 2010, 2011. I got really wrapped up in how they made vaccines back then, which was a gruesome process. And there was a lot of blood involved, it was just a sloppy, barbaric way. You know, now it's so clinical. But then I looked at all of these charts and drawings and illustrations of like, you know, you would give a horse, say, typhoid. Then I think it was actually to make the diphtheria vaccine. Then at a certain moment, you'd have to like slice the jugular, capture the blood in a bucket, but it would be all over, you know, someone would kick over the bucket. They'd have to start again with a different horse. It'd be like, oh my God, there's like a pile of horse corpses in one corner. There's blood all over the place just to get a couple of vials of vaccine. And these places were often in the city. You know, it's hard to imagine New York at any time that's not now. And so I definitely, because it was so vivid to me, I wanted to include that in the book. I think I did just glancingly, nothing in depth, because it would have been sort of, you know, not totally relevant.
Sure.
There was a lot of that then, especially like images of New York, how the streets were empty, you know, but there's only so much of that a reader can take or needs to know. A professor of mine at UVA gave me a very wise piece of advice years ago when I was telling him about my sort of trepidations about writing a historical novel, in particular, as a woman in particular, because so often historical fiction and women's fiction sort of bleed together.
Sure.
And he said, if you find yourself writing about the hats and the buttons too much, then you're on the wrong path. You know, get back to the human and what's important, and what you would include if the novel were set in 2020 or 1907. And I kept that in mind as I was writing, and I think it really helped me stay on track.
Sure, because it's easy to get bogged down, I imagine, in facts and details because you spend all this time researching it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it has to feel organic. I mean, I think every sentence in a book has to do some work toward moving the story. And if you just include stuff because it's interesting to you, it just ends up being, I think, not a very high quality novel. You know, the temptation is strong at times, but that's what the editing process is for. And I tried not to be too worried about that, but then I was kind of brutal when the time came to cut, you know.
Yeah. Thank you. So if you wrote this book now, you completed it 8 years ago now, I think, something like that.
What are we in, Veronica? It came out in 2013. So I completed it probably in 2012. Yeah, so that's 8, yeah.
So obviously everything's changed since 2012. You know, it's been a very rapid set of years. Do you think you would have approached any of your books differently if you've written them now, but particularly Fever, I guess we're there.
I don't know. It's something I've never thought about. You know, once a book is done, I don't even read it over in hardback in case I see something that I want to change and I can't. I think this has to do with being a control freak and maybe a perfectionist. I think that I would try to hedge against those people who imagine that they would do things differently. You know, the people who are judgmental of any bad decision that a character makes. But otherwise, no, I think I included everything I wanted to include in that book. I mean, at least from the historical record. A lot of it is fiction, of course. She left nothing behind, no letters, no diaries. And so I could fictionalize her personality entirely. But no, I was happy with the way that that book turned out for the most part. I'd hate to crack it right now. I'm sure I'd find a sentence in the first page I want to change.
Right.
But most of my changes are sort of on the local level, sentence wise, extra words, adverbs that don't need to be there, things like that.
Things that are more likely to bother you maybe than the general reader.
Yeah, maybe. I did use the word, I think, teenager somewhere. I've gotten like a million emails about that. And that was a mistake. I think I also used the word quiche. I would take that out.
That's fair.
People love to find mistakes in books and then email the author. And I think they think they're being helpful. But if all the books have already shipped to the stores, like how do you imagine that's helpful?
Yeah, I think that's just feedback on the internet in general, right? People like the feeling of being correct.
I guess. Someone did that with Ask Again. Yes, it was funny. She pointed out that, I hope it was no one in this, actually it was somebody in the Midwest, that on one particular page, Kate is opening up a package of hot dogs, but on another page, she's marinating steak, London broil. And so the woman's like, are they having hot dogs or steak? I'm like, oh my God. So the hot dogs are for the kids. The steak is for the adults. I don't know how you people do it wherever you live, but that's how we do it, But people love to find mistakes and they get jazzed about pointing them out. Please don't do that.
Especially if the book's done.
Only if if it's not done, then okay, of course. That's what an editor's for. But if it's done, there's nothing I can do.
Sure. It just keeps you up at night, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in Fever, you also managed to slip in some other big disasters of the 20th century, the General Slocum steamboat sinking, the Titanic disaster, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Was that to kind of set the stage for what was going on, just to add to the tension, or?
Yeah, I wanted to sort of place Mary's story in a historical context. I feel like a lot of people know about the Titanic and know about New York and London and the world at that time. And so at least when I'm reading historical fiction or if I'm learning about history, I like to think, of two things alongside one another. Like Shakespeare is alive over here, the Dutch are settling New York over here. I don't know if that's true. Don't fact check that, but you get my point. And so I think I wanted to mention those other things to sort of show that New York was a big teeming place and she was just a small part of it. Also, because of Mary's work, what she did for a living, and because of the way I write, I really wanted to nail what people would be talking about, in the back room. If you're washing clothes and you're with two other women and there's a lot of work to be done. You do, shoot the breeze, I'm sure, all day. This is just human nature if you're allowed to do so. I don't think most people, like I've read some historical novels where I guess they're trying to reference who the president is at that time, or, I don't think people talk about it. The Titanic would have been a topic people would have just talked about because it was disastrous, but it was also sexy. Rich people died. The people who survived versus the people who, didn't, and what happened to all that money. And, and so I thought that the people working in the back room, the working class, would be talking about those things. Mm-hmm. The Triangle Shirtwaist fire brought everything I read about that, reminded me so much of September 11th.
Yeah, absolutely.
That I did want that to haunt the book, to an extent. And I started thinking of my New York on that day. I was on Bleecker Street in New York when the first plane hit. And just that mood in the city really matched what I read about that day and that week in New York City when the girls, they really were girls, started jumping, from those windows to get away from the fire. That the whole city was in mourning. It was another battle scar that New York wore. And I think of Fever as being very much a New York novel.
Yeah.
So that's why I included that.
Thank you. And I see right behind you, you have your latest book coming out in paperback.
Yep. Yes. They kept the cover the same. They added this little fancy thing with like a bunch of quotes and stuff. Yeah, it looks great. They added the Jimmy Fallon little insignia from the summer reads, which was cool. It comes out next Tuesday.
Great.
May 5th. And I was supposed to go on this big 16 city tour I was really excited for, but of course, none of that is happening.
Well, thanks for talking to us instead. We appreciate
Yeah.
it.
This is much easier.
So to get into Ask Again, Yes, a little bit. Obviously, this book does make a lot of us think about Rockland County a little bit. Brian said when he was reading it, he specifically saw a house on Central Avenue, ShopRite for the grocery store scene, and Rockland Psych came to mind as well. I
Oh,
don't know
okay.
if you felt like those were places that you had in mind, but I can see how he got there for sure. So was there like do you think those places kind of permeated through it? Or?
Not Rockland Psychiatric that much, but sure, Food King is ShopRite. I mean, it's impossible to explain why I had to fictionalize it. I think kind of like what I was saying earlier, maybe I was already traumatized by getting emails about mistakes. I didn't want to name it Pearl River and then have someone say, the gazebo didn't get lighting until 1987. And here we're in 1986. It's such a distraction and it doesn't matter. However, I did have Pearl River in mind. It's not a one-for-one match, but I did think of Pearl River in proximity to some of the wealthier towns. I reference Riverside, which was not very creative. I sort of had Piermont or like Palisades in mind. So yeah, I mean, it is Rockland because I think Rockland's an unusual place. I mean, I said this earlier, but we're in striking distance of the city. So many people go into the city and out each day, but a lot of people here still seem to be facing north, more upstate, and identify more strongly with upstate. Some are the opposite. And so, for that reason, I guess I wanted it to be set here. I've done a ton of events in Westchester, and it's always interesting to me. I did one in Scarsdale, of all places, and two women were insistent that it was Scarsdale. And how do you say it's not? I was like, it is for sure not Scarsdale.
Right, totally different economic bracket.
Right. I know. I didn't want to be, I'm like, this is not these like crumbling, beautiful stone walls. And so, but it's hard to get into that without either insulting Pearl River, which is a place I love, or Scarsdale, which is, maybe a little too posh for me. So it was very funny that people are claiming it. Bedford, a woman's like, is this Bedford? I'm like, no, it's not Bedford. Surely not.
I think part of that is there's just so few stories that take place in the suburbs around Manhattan. New York is such a dominant city in literature and TV. I think we all get excited when we're like, oh, this could be us right here.
Yeah, right. I know. True. And it's a different experience growing up within eye shot, literally, of the city. You can see it on clear days. And then to go to it was exciting, but then we always had to leave it too. Right. And it always was a thing, like the city, are we going to the city? I don't know. It's my city, but people who grew up there would say, I'm an interloper, I'm bridge and tunnel, but it's the city I've oriented myself around my entire life and always will.
And you lived there for a few years, you said as well, right?
Yeah, I lived there for 9 years. 4 of those years were college. I didn't know that my college dorm room would be the nicest apartment I'd have for the next decade. I could see the Hudson. It was beautiful. I was like, oh, I'll just get a little place like this. But that did not work out for a little while.
It's pretty hard to get a little place like that anywhere in the city these days. Right. So obviously one of the themes that's running through Ask Again, Yes is the silence that can cloak around mental illness, particularly. And I was curious, was that a theme that you gravitated towards because it still permeates us today, or do you think we've moved through that and you want to talk about the historical aspect of it?
I mean, I think that all of this depends on individual families, individual cultures, and individuals. I mean, I think we've come a long way between the 1960s and now, certainly. The way we talk about mental illness, the way we treat it, the way we face it or don't. But I do think there are people who cannot face what's going on in their own lives. And if something takes them by surprise, maybe a response like, for example, Brian Stanhope had, would happen today. I think his response is not really rooted in time. I think he was just very young when he got this sort of handed to him in a partner. And he was in denial, and he was a little bit of a coward, and he made a move to save his own life. I think that the way people treated Anne might be different now. I would hope it would be. But Anne kept this a secret, really tamped down for a long time. I don't think most people would know that anything was necessarily wrong with her in the sense that it was diagnosable, or that it required medication or a regular relationship with a doctor of some kind. She had, and I talked to a lot of doctors about what specifically was wrong with her. I saw her in a very specific way. And the thing about mental illness is a diagnosis can sort of change over time. We have different words for the same things. Two diagnosis of, say, bipolar disorder, for example, could look very different in two different people. And so when I was first writing, I wanted to sort of make sure I captured an illness, exactly right. Like if you have this specific mood disorder, and then it was increasingly frustrating that I'd read then, say, another memoir that contradicted what I thought was the gold standard of this particular, say, paranoia or clinical depression or something. And then the more I talk to doctors, the more I realize you can't capture it in complete, you might have this with aspects of this and that. And I decided in the end to have that be a good thing in a way, because then I could make Anne who she needed to be. I just had to make sure that what was wrong with her was possible, and that the degree of recovery was possible, and stuff like that. I think I veered away from your question, though. What was your question?
No, you answered it. I think you captured that really effectively. What a struggle that can be, to depict. I think mental illness is a very hard thing to depict compassionately.
Yeah.
I thought you did a great job.
Well, I think I like I said, I've read a lot of memoirs, and they were the most helpful of all. And a common theme in all of them was this idea of fear. Like, so if a person acts out the way, I don't want to spoil the plot for anybody, but there's a moment in the grocery store where Anne she sort of acts out. And I think when you're receiving that, if you're a witness, you're shopping in the grocery store and someone starts behaving in a certain way, it feels aggressive. It feels threatening. You might feel, gather your kids close to you. You might want to get the hell out of there. But inside her head, it's a really different experience. She's coming out of a place of fear. And once, I don't know, for me, I think for most people, if you realize someone is afraid, then you have sympathy for them. And once that kind of like turned for me, then she as a character became more clear, and also became someone I felt I could manage better. And I wasn't scared to enter her point of view anymore.
That's great. I think you did a wonderful job with that. And part of that is you have these shifting point of views throughout the book. And was there a conscious storytelling choice that you made?
The truth is, I don't know. I wrote this book all different ways, and that's the way that felt worked the best for me. I had alternating points of view in The Walking People. I really didn't want to do it again, but I think maybe, and I'm doing it again in my new novel, even though I swore up and down that I would not. I think the thing that I'm most attracted to, I guess, in a character is a person who says one thing, thinks another thing, and feels another thing. Those are three different things. And I think some of those, if I'm making sense, can be hidden. We can hide from ourselves. If you say, I'm fine, and you think to yourself, it's totally fine, and inside your heart is pounding, you feel sick. We are layered in so many ways to sort of, I don't know, protect ourselves from ourselves. And I think in order to get at that in a character, I have to have other people observing them, because they're not trustworthy observers of themselves. And I find the third person is better for this than the first person. And then multiple third person points of view. It's like the classic, there's her story and his story and then the real story, but that's true for everything. how you are coming off in your own head is maybe not the way you're coming off to some other people. And I think capturing all of that and having the reader understand that something lies in the middle, it implicates the reader in the story too. It makes the reader smarter in a way than any single character. And I think that does something for reader engagement. It sort of drops, it sort of breaks the glass, I guess. And some books I read, I don't know if I'm explaining this well, but it's good. The writing is strong. The story is interesting. And yet it feels as if I'm being held at arm's length. And I'm not really moved, and I don't know why. And I think the books I feel really moved by are the ones that drop that distance and bring the reader into a place where they are in the story. And I think the multiple point of view for me is how I do that.
I think it's great. I think you explained it really well, actually.
Okay.
I like it. It makes sense to me. We did get a question in our Q&A here that relates to this book. How close are you to the NYPD in your personal life? It's from Liz Berg.
I have no NYPD in my family, which I guess is unusual for an Irish family. But I grew up in Pearl River, as I mentioned, and a lot of the dads of my friends growing up were cops in the city. And I think at one point, I remember very clearly being at my friend's pool, and her dad was flipping burgers on the grill, and he was wearing black dress socks with shorts, and he had a gun strapped on him. And I remember, like, no one seemed to think that was strange. My dad was a sandhog. We didn't have guns in the house. But I was like, holy smokes, that's a gun. And then I'm like, oh, well, they all must have it. It's your off duty. I kind of got smarter about it as I got older. But I think that one moment made me realize that what Mr. So-and-so does at work makes him a much different type of person than how he is when he's like jolly and, messing around in his backyard and hanging out with his kids, at home. And how much mental energy it must take to go from one world to another. So I think I've always been interested in police work. When I grew up, I was a full adult. I was probably 30 years old when I realized that some of the men I knew were active detectives or on different squads in Fort Apache during some of the worst years. And you would never know it. And so all jobs take a certain amount of mental dexterity, leaving work and entering your personal life. But that one, to me, I think would be the hardest for me to pull off personally. And so I guess I started observing cops from a distance when I was a kid. But it was great. Then knowing so many, I was able to interview a bunch and get them to tell me all their stories. And holy cow, do cops like to tell stories. The job. Like, wow, on and on. And I'd be like, well, how did you feel? And they're like, what? So it was good.
Good. So related to that, obviously also being an immigrant plays into the book as well. You mentioned both of your parents immigrated from Ireland.
Yeah.
And that's a theme you seem to return to. So obviously that had a pretty large impact on you.
Yeah.
So how do you think, is it something you are returning to in your next book? Is this something that you think you revisit?
Yeah, I think immigration for me is mixed up with class. I am determined to write a book where nobody's from Ireland. I thought this, again, yes, might be the book. And then I realized it wasn't. I don't know. Again, it's just something that's in me. I think I'm interested in identity because growing up as a child of Irish immigrants, when you're home in your house in New York, whenever people talk, we talked of home constantly, but home always meant Ireland. When we go home or at home, they do this, or this is what we'd eat at home on this day. But then when we'd go to Ireland, which we did a lot, I never felt more American. I was just different. I had different things. I had different experiences. I had my champion sweatshirts. We were going to the swim club. And this was Ireland in the 80s. It wasn't like the way it is now. And so I don't know. I didn't know, I guess, who I was. There's so many people, especially in Pearl River, who are very proud of their Irish heritage, rightly so. but it doesn't, for me, bear a strong resemblance to Ireland. And so I don't know, I think I've been thinking a lot about what we're trying to capture and what we're missing. You know, so many immigrants, and I don't think this is just true for Irish people, they get to the United States and the world that they left goes into a time capsule and it never really moves on. So we, inside my house was like Ireland in 1965 for my whole childhood. Whereas in actual Ireland, my first cousins were moving on. They were listening to Bon Jovi. They were the first to go to like Lady Gaga concerts. They were, and we were playing the fiddle and going to Irish dancing lessons. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's just really interesting to me. And it's something I keep coming back to. In Ask Again, Yes, I think I was really frustrated with a lot of depictions of Irish America being too sentimental, hearing the harp in the distance and getting weepy-eyed about this and that. And Ireland has been romanticized in America to a degree that I don't know, it grates on me a little bit. I mean, I think Ireland is a beautiful place and my parents were sorry to have to leave it. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people for whom it was a traumatic place at a time when trauma was not spoken of. And so I wanted to write people who immigrated from Ireland who had no interest in going back. It just wasn't a place that they longed for in the way that I've only seen in literature. And so that's why I think that Anne and Frances ended up being Irish. And I purposely made them both have sort of not a similar experience, but they both had misgivings about where they're from, which left them both a little bit lost in New York, because then where is home? And that bonded them. In the end, it sort of comes to a head, but I always thought of them as being similar in that way.
Yeah, I think that's very real, for all kinds of immigrants. There's a reason that you left, which is hard to grapple with when you feel, what I say as a Jew, when you're in the diaspora, that's a difficult disconnect to be away from home, a home that you may never even have seen, and yet feel like a stranger in your new home country.
Right. Such an odd way to live.
It's tough. It's a tough thing to grapple with. So just to pull back the lens a little bit further and talk more generally, this one ties in. So Mary Phillips, who's our teen librarian, you spoke more about, the Irish immigration thing, but she really connected, she said, with some of the place names like Idlewild Airport and Bamberger's. She was talking about going out of business, but she still has Christmas ornaments in a Bamberger's box. And she
wow.
Those were memories of yours, or were those rooted in research as well?
No, those were research based. Bamberger's, I think, was still around when I was a kid. I was born in 1977. So Idlewild was gone. It was already Kennedy. But during that time, Francis would have landed at Idlewild. He wouldn't have landed at Kennedy. Mm-hmm. Bamberger's has sort of a mythical status, maybe. My mother refers to Bamberger's all the time. I think my mom is one of 9. There's 8 sisters and a brother. And one of them, I think my Aunt May, worked at Bamberger's or Gimbel's. What's Gimbel's? Does anyone know? Someone out there probably knows.
If you know, put it in the chat.
Yeah, another department store. And department stores, I think, were different in the 60s and 70s. They seemed a little bit more posh. We go in there in our sweatpants and like grab what we need. But yeah, that part of the research is always really fun. Mm-hmm. And also it's just like washed in nostalgia. And I can tell myself that I'm doing work when I'm not, if I'm reading about these things. Yeah.
Well, it made Mary's day, so it was worthwhile.
Oh, good. Well, I think it roots people in time a little bit too, brings
Yeah,
back.
I mean, obviously it made her think of a very specific thing that she owned, that was
good
home. So she was looking at that box. So we talked about that. So you mentioned that you're working on your next book. Is there anything you can tell us about it, or is it still a big secret?
It's going to take forever and it's a mess. That's all I can tell you.
Okay. That's fair.
Terrible. I mean, hopefully I'm not supposed to say that. I don't know. They're all terrible before they're good. I keep telling myself that. I actually went so far as to look up old emails I sent to my friend who reads for me when I had to read pages of Ask Again, Yes. And then I looked at the attachment and I'm like, oh God, this was really bad. But it's always really bad before it's good. I tell my students this, I tell myself this, it's still hard to go through, but yeah, I'm taking everything day by day. I was moving along at a good clip and then this all happened. So I'm trying my best. I also don't know, it's a weird time for artists. It's a weird time for everyone, but it seems impossible to write a book where this won't make its way in. I can't write a book in 2020, set in 2020 without, I don't want to make this the headline. The story is already in place, but you just have to figure out how to deal with it. And I think everybody is going through that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, either you set it back a couple of years or you have to grapple with it, I guess.
Right.
So Rita in the chat said, Gimbel's was across the street from Macy's. Never was quite what Macy's became. She worked there early in her career. So
okay.
I guess it was a department store. Another Q&A question that just came in. Your characters are so well developed. What do you attribute that to?
I don't know, actually. I just think of them as people, and then I write the details that I don't know, I don't know. I mean, I don't really know how I'm doing anything. I just do it. But you want a full person, you want to believe that someone is alive, and so I try to make them as fully fleshed out as I can. Often, and this might help, I know things about them that don't end up included in the book. Like I know what kind of music they listen to. I know what kind of cars they drive and what kind of cars they wish they drove. Lots of things that I think don't really matter to the story a lot of times, but it helps give the writing itself, the prose, some authority, I guess. I mean, writing fiction is a little bit like lying. If you deliver your lie with confidence, without blinking and looking someone in the eye, you'll be believed. If you don't, the person receiving that information is sort of onto you. And I think the minute a reader is like, I don't know, is this person really working at wherever? Then they're out of the story and you're done. You've lost them. And so I try to make it's like a seduction. You try to make the people as believable as you can make them.
So we did have another question in the Q&A as well, which came up in the chat. It's a little personal, so feel free, take it as you want. But they were asking about the theme of alcoholism and if that was something that you had personal experience with, I guess because it was well drawn. So they just wanted to touch on that.
I thankfully have not a lot of experience with alcoholics in my immediate circle. Certainly, once you get 1 degree out of my nuclear family, it's something that I know is lurking. I mean, there are alcoholics in my life, for sure. And there are also so many different types of having a problem with alcohol. I wanted to represent the type that I think is most common, at least in my life, which is the functional alcoholic, not the stumbling into a ditch, not able to hold a job type of alcoholic. I am very hesitant. I think alcohol is a problem in a lot of cultures. I only can reference the culture I'm in. One of the things I thought about a lot when I was writing this book, I sort of hit, I don't know, my friends get upset when I call 40 middle age, I think because I'm sweeping them up with me, but I'm now 42. And I think when I arrived in my 40s, I realized that people I know, either immediately or sort of tangentially, are going in different directions all of a sudden. And what I mean, I guess I'm being vague, but I had my first drink, I think I was like 12. My friend and I, we snuck in, we put Seagram 7 in our Slurpees, and then we went to the movie theater, got obliterated, and then had to sit in a park until we were, coherent enough to go home. That is very, very young. And I think of that a lot. And I don't know why I don't have a problem with alcohol. I feel like I got off scot-free for some reason that I don't understand. I'm just not that interested in it. Some people did not get off so easily. but I can't for the life of me tell the difference between them and me. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Or
why did that happen? Our parents and the previous generation always talks about the gene, it's inherited. Well, so-and-so's and Irish people, they go back like bloodlines 200 years. Well, his great grandfather was a famous drunk in Cork or whatever. And that doesn't interest me that much, but for the purposes of this book, it's just something that I thought about a lot. The heartbreak of that and the randomness of it. And I think because I don't think I'm susceptible to that particular sort of addiction, I'm interested in it. I don't know why. If something is really bad for you, why don't you just stop? And I believe it when people say they can't. It's like any addiction. And so I try to imagine what it would be like to just not be able to that easily. But sure, I mean, alcoholism has certainly touched my life. There have been moments I've been afraid of it for people who are closer to me. And as a writer, you see a scary thing and then you imagine it unfurling in a way that it didn't in real life. You can sort of see down a road that you didn't end up taking. And that's what makes it an interesting story to write.
Sure. So we have a few little questions at the end, and if that's okay with you, maybe we'll see if the audience has anything extra.
Sure.
But I'm obligated to ask, as a librarian, what was the last good book that you read?
I've read a ton. Unfortunately, I read so many books before they're out for blurbs and stuff like that. So I'm trying to think of one that's actually out right now. Saint Ivo by Joanna Hershen, I thought was great. It came out last week. The Dutch House by Ann Patchett, I thought was one of her best books. And I'm a huge Ann Patchett fan. I'm going to look behind me at my shelves. Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson, I absolutely loved. My friend, this is an endorsement, and she is my friend, but it's also a great book, has a book out, I think today, called The Book of V. Mm-hmm. She's written, her name is Anna Solomon. She's written 2 historical novels. This is both historical and contemporary. It takes place sort of like The Hours. The structure is similar to that. And it's a wonderful book you guys should check out. Order for the library if you haven't.
Okay. I'll definitely recommend that. Although I think the person who orders is here, so maybe they'll go ahead and do that. Okay. So our last question from us, just a note to anybody who's attending, if you have questions, if you want to put them in the chat, we have a few more minutes. I don't want to take up too much of your time. But the last question for me is just in general, who are some of your favorite authors? You just said Ann Patchett, obviously. So.
Ann Patchett is a big one. Elizabeth Strout, Louise Erdrich. Those are like 3 huge, probably the biggest influences on me as an adult writer. Reading fiction by women I admire. Probably the most influential writer on my life and in my style is William Trevor, who is now no longer with us. But his short stories were really sort of life-changing for me. First of all, he wrote about people who I felt I knew. He is a really great stylist. He's sort of a minimalist, and he puts a lot on the reader to interpret. There's a short story called Mrs. Silly by William Trevor that is probably my favorite piece of literature of all time. Who else? Let me turn my head a moment. It's like when I get asked this question that I've never read a book before. I'm like, have I?
You just immediately go blank, right?
I don't remember any. No. I'm afraid I'm butchering his name. Mohsin Hamed, Exit West. He wrote this book that I've read. I loved Exit West. I read his backlist. It's called How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, which sounds like a self-help book. It's not. It's a novel. I thought it was absolutely wonderful. What else? I mean, these certain books are more influential on me sometimes than writers, like Atonement was big for me. Let the Great World Spin, The Known World, a book by Edward P. Jones, and so on. So I'm afraid I've been babbling.
No, it's good. We appreciate all the recommendations. Trust me. We all have more time to read right now. So I think The more recommendations we can get, the better. So I
I'm
just
hearing
want
though,
to
for
say,
some people, it's hard to concentrate, which I
yes,
can understand.
I've read
There's
about half of one book, to be honest. I haven't been
oh,
prolific.
really, I get that. Like it's hard, you're just everyone's easily distractible and no one knows what's going on.
Yeah, it's an interesting time.
Yeah.
But I just want to say thank you so much for today. I really appreciate you coming on and speaking with us. And if you know anybody out there who missed this and wants to see it, we're going to get it edited up on our YouTube channel, which is just New
Okay,
City
cool.
Library on YouTube. All right, so thank you
Awesome.
so much. And
All right.
bye, everybody. Have a
Stay
great
well, everybody. Thank you for having me. Okay.